Right now you're probably lying in bed with your phone glowing in the dark. Maybe it's midnight in Manila, or 3 a.m. in Amsterdam, or you're winding down after work in California. Comment below and let me know where you are and what time it is. I actually read these, and it's wild seeing Berlin at breakfast and Boston at bedtime all watching the same story. And if you're here to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe hit subscribe and let's dive in. Imagine waking up tomorrow and the sun doesn't rise. Not like a cloudy day, not like an eclipse. The sun comes up, but it's just a dim blue ghost in the sky, barely brighter than the full moon. You can stare directly at it without hurting your eyes, and it stays that way for 18 months, no warning, no explanation, just darkness. This actually happened. The year was 536 AD, and it was, according to medieval historian Michael McCormick of Harvard University, the worst year to be alive in human history. Not the Black Death, not World War II, not any of the catastrophes you learned about in school. 536 AD. For over 1,000 years this event was hidden in fragments of old manuscripts. Byzantine historians mentioned it, Chinese chroniclers recorded it, Irish monks wrote about it in the margins of religious texts. But nobody connected the dots. Nobody realized that all across the world, from Constantinople to China, from Ireland to Indonesia, people were experiencing the same nightmare. The sun had disappeared. And here's the thing that kept scientists awake for decades. They knew something catastrophic happened in 536 AD. The historical accounts were too consistent, too widespread to be fiction. But what could cause the entire planet to go dark for a year and a half? What kind of disaster operates on that scale? The mystery haunted researchers for centuries. Some thought it was just exaggerated medieval superstition. Dark Ages people being dramatic about bad weather. Others suspected something real but couldn't prove it. The evidence was scattered across continents, buried in ice cores and tree rings and ancient documents written in dead languages. Then in 2018, scientists finally cracked the case, and the answer was so much worse than anyone imagined. See, 536 AD wasn't just about darkness. That was only the beginning. The disappearance of the sun triggered a cascade of catastrophes that would reshape human civilization. The dim sun meant crop failures. Crop failures meant famine. Famine meant social collapse. And into that weakened, starving world came one of the deadliest plagues in human history. Within a decade, entire empires were on their knees. The Eastern Roman Empire, the most powerful state on earth, lost half its population. The Sasanian Persian Empire collapsed into chaos. In China, dynasties fell. In Mesoamerica, the great city of Teotihuacan was abandoned. All across the northern hemisphere, societies that had flourished for centuries simply fell apart. And nobody knew why. To the people living through it, it must have felt like the apocalypse, like God had abandoned them, like the world was ending. They had no concept of volcanic eruptions causing global climate change, no understanding of how dust in the stratosphere blocks sunlight, no framework for understanding what was happening to them. They just knew the sun was gone, their children were starving, and death was everywhere. You know that feeling when you realize how fragile everything is, like when the power goes out and suddenly you remember that civilization is just a thin layer between us and chaos? That's what 536 AD revealed. How quickly things can fall apart when the climate turns against us. How interconnected everything is. How one volcanic eruption on the other side of the world can topple empires. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. Some societies survived, some even thrived. While the Roman Empire was collapsing, certain groups adapted. They found ways to grow food in the darkness. They maintained order when everything around them was chaos. They kept records and preserved knowledge that would have otherwise been lost forever. The question that obsessed historians was simple but profound. Why did some civilizations fall while others survived? What was the difference? Was it geography, technology, social organization, luck? The answers, discovered through decades of scientific detective work, tell us something crucial about ourselves, about resilience, about adaptation, about what it takes to survive when the world goes dark. So get comfortable, let your mind drift. Because we're going back 1,500 years to the worst year in human history, to a time when the sun disappeared and civilization hung by a thread, to the volcanic winter that ended empires, to 536 AD. But here's the thing about historical catastrophes. They don't announce themselves with convenient labels. Nobody in 536 AD woke up and thought, "This is the year that will be remembered as humanity's darkest hour." They just knew something was profoundly, terrifyingly wrong, and they wrote about it. Because when the world stops making sense, when the sun itself betrays you, you need to record what's happening. Maybe as a warning, maybe as a plea to the gods, maybe just because the human mind demands explanation, even when none exists. The first voice we hear comes from the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople, the greatest city in the world at that time, home to maybe 500,000 people, centre of trade and learning, the bridge between East and West. And there, in the palace, a lawyer named Procopius is serving as advisor to the general Belisarius. Procopius is writing his Wars of Justinian, a detailed history of the emperor's military campaigns. He's a careful observer, not prone to exaggeration or supernatural explanations, which makes what he writes next even more chilling. During this year, Procopius records, a most dread portent took place, for the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon during this whole year, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not clear nor such as it is accustomed to shed. Read that again. The sun gave forth its light without brightness. Not an eclipse, which Procopius knew about and could identify. This was something else, something that lasted not hours or days, but the entire year. He continues, "And from the time when this thing happened, men were free neither from war nor pestilence nor any other thing leading to death." Now, Procopius was there. He watched this unfold day by day. Imagine his perspective. You wake up morning after morning, and the sun is wrong. Not gone, not darkened completely, but dimmed. Like looking at it through smoke, except there's no fire. Like permanent twilight, except it's supposed to be noon. Day after day, week after week, month after month, and the sun refuses to give its full light. The psychological impact would have been devastating. Humans are hardwired to respond to sunlight. It regulates our sleep cycles, our moods, our entire sense of order in the world. Take that away, and reality itself becomes uncertain. If the sun can fail, what else might betray you? But Procopius wasn't alone in witnessing this phenomenon. All across the world, people were looking up at the same terrifying sky and trying to make sense of what they were seeing. In China, imperial astronomers whose entire job was tracking celestial phenomena recorded something they'd never seen before. The Chinese kept meticulous records. It was part of how they legitimized imperial authority, proving that the emperor maintained the mandate of heaven by correctly predicting and explaining natural events. The chronicles from 536 describe what they called yellow dust raining like snow, not a metaphor, an actual description. Dust falling from the sky in quantities large enough to blanket the ground. The sun appearing as a pale ghost of itself, barely visible through the haze. Summer temperatures dropping so low that crops failed across multiple provinces. The official histories record widespread famine starting that year, with mortality rates climbing so high that local officials stopped keeping accurate counts. In the Chinese imperial system, natural disasters weren't just unfortunate events, they were signs that something had gone wrong with the cosmic order, that the emperor might be losing heaven's favour. So when the dust fell, and the sun dimmed and the crops died, it wasn't just a practical crisis. It was an existential threat to the entire social order. The astronomers recorded everything, desperately searching for patterns or explanations that might restore confidence in the system. They noted frost in summer months. Think about that. China in July, and there's frost on the ground in regions where it should be sweltering. Peasants walking out to fields expecting to see ripening grain, finding instead withered stalks and frozen earth. The chroniclers describe people eating bark from trees, digging up roots, anything to survive as the normal growing season simply refused to arrive. Over in Ireland, monks in their scriptoriums were keeping their own records. The Irish annals are fascinating sources because they're remarkably consistent across multiple monasteries. Different scribes in different locations recording the same events, which gives us confidence they're describing real phenomena, not mythological embellishments. The Annals of Ulster note for the year 536, a failure of bread in the year 536 AD, simple words hiding a catastrophe. Failure of bread meant the harvest didn't come. In an agricultural society where most people lived season to season, where there were no significant grain reserves, where there was no global food trade to fall back on, failure of bread meant starvation. It meant watching your children's bellies swell with hunger. It meant communities breaking down as desperate people fought over whatever scraps remained. Other Irish chronicles describe something even more unsettling. They record that the summer of 536 was so cold that the land could not be tilled. The ground was too frozen, too hard. Farmers couldn't even plant crops for the next season. This wasn't just one bad harvest. It was a cascading failure. No harvest this year, no seed grain for next year, no food stored for the winter, no certainty that conditions would improve. The psychological weight of that uncertainty. Generation after generation, your ancestors had followed the same patterns. Plant in spring, tend through summer, harvest in fall, store for winter, the rhythm of life itself, as dependable as sunrise. And now that rhythm was broken. The seasons had failed. How do you maintain hope when the fundamental patterns of existence stop working? Around the Mediterranean, people were describing something they called the dry fog. This phrase appears in multiple sources from different regions, always describing the same phenomenon, a haze that hung in the air constantly, that reduced visibility, that made the sun appear weak and distant. But unlike normal fog, which came from moisture, this fog was dry. It didn't feel damp. It didn't dissipate with heat or wind. It just persisted, day after day, month after month. Michael the Syrian, writing in the 12th century but drawing on earlier sources, describes how the sun became dark and its darkness lasted for 18 months. Each day it shone for about 4 hours, and still this light was only a feeble shadow. Everyone declared that the sun would never recover its full light. 18 months. Think about living through 18 months of dimmed sunlight That's a summer, fall, winter, and most of another summer, all under a sky that refuses to clear. Imagine the dread that would accumulate. The first month, maybe you think it's temporary. The third month, you start to worry. By the 6th month, you're beginning to believe this might be permanent. By the 12th month, you're watching your food stores run out with no new harvest coming, and you're starting to understand that you might not survive this. And remember, these people had no scientific framework to understand what was happening. They couldn't say volcanic aerosols in the stratosphere are blocking solar radiation. They had to explain it through the only frameworks they had: divine punishment, celestial disorder, the end times, the terror that creates. It's not just physical suffering from hunger and cold, it's existential dread. The world itself seems to be ending. God or the gods have turned their faces away. The cosmic order has failed, and nobody knows why or when or if it will ever be restored. Byzantine sources beyond Procopius confirm the same observations. John of Ephesus, another contemporary historian, writes about how the sun was dark and its darkness lasted for 18 months. Each day it shone for about 4 hours, and still this light was only a feeble shadow. The fruits did not ripen, and the wine tasted like sour grapes. That detail about the wine is revealing. It tells us that grapes were growing, vines were doing their thing, but without sufficient sunlight and warmth, the grapes couldn't develop their sugars. So wine production, a crucial part of Mediterranean economy and culture, collapsed. Trade networks that depended on wine as a commodity broke down. Religious ceremonies that required wine for sacraments faced shortages. Economic systems built on viticultural wealth evaporated. The sources describe unprecedented cold during what should have been the warmest months. Summer temperatures that felt like early spring. In regions around the Mediterranean where people were adapted to hot, dry summers, suddenly they're experiencing temperatures cold enough to require heating fires in July. Clothing designed for warmth becomes necessary in midsummer. Agricultural practices refined over centuries suddenly don't work because the seasons themselves have shifted. The Byzantine historian Zachariah of Mytilene adds another chilling detail. There was a sign from the sun, the like of which had never been seen and reported before. The sun became dark, and its darkness lasted for 18 months. Each day it shone for about 4 hours, and still this light was only a feeble shadow. Notice how multiple sources converge on that same detail. 18 months, 4 hours of dim light per day. These aren't isolated accounts or exaggerated stories. This is consistent testimony from observers across thousands of miles, all describing the same phenomenon. When historians see this kind of convergence, it's powerful evidence that something real and extraordinary was happening. But perhaps the most psychologically revealing accounts come from how people interpreted what they were seeing. A Syrian chronicle describes people believing the world was coming to an end. Not metaphorically, they literally thought they were witnessing the apocalypse. The sun failing is, after all, one of the classic signs of the end times in multiple religious traditions. Christians, Jews, pagans, Zoroastrians all had prophecies about the sun darkening as a harbinger of ultimate judgment. So when it actually happened, when the sun actually dimmed and stayed dimmed for month after month, it's not hard to understand why people thought the end had arrived. They sold their possessions for nothing, because what's the point of wealth if the world is ending? They abandoned long-term planning because there was no long-term. They made desperate appeals to their gods because divine intervention seemed like the only possible salvation. The archaeological evidence backs up these written accounts in ways that make them even more haunting. Tree ring data from this period shows what dendrochronologists call frost rings, damage patterns caused by unseasonable freezing. Trees across Europe, Asia, and North America all show severely stunted growth for 536 and several years after. This is global synchronization, proof that whatever caused the dimming affected the entire planet simultaneously. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica show massive sulfate deposits from precisely this period. Chemical signatures of volcanic aerosols falling out of the atmosphere and being preserved in ancient ice. The chemistry confirms what the written sources described. Something filled the sky with light-blocking particles, something massive enough to affect the entire planet's climate for years. Pollen analysis from lake sediments shows dramatic declines in agricultural crops and increases in weeds and pioneer species. This tells us that farmland was being abandoned, that cultivated landscapes were reverting to wild vegetation. Populations were collapsing too fast to maintain their fields. The land itself was recording human suffering in layers of mud at the bottom of lakes. Mass graves from this period show unusual patterns, not organized burials but hasty depositions of multiple bodies at once, evidence of famine in the bones, lesions and growth defect caused by severe malnutrition. Populations dying faster than they could be properly buried, communities overwhelmed by mortality rates they'd never experienced before. One particularly striking archaeological find comes from Scandinavia. Several wealthy estate halls that had been continuously occupied for generations were suddenly abandoned in 536-537, just left empty, with valuables still inside. The owners didn't move somewhere else, they just vanished. Presumably dead. Possibly the entire local population wiped out by some combination of famine, cold, and the diseases that followed. The archaeological signature of social collapse preserved in abandoned buildings and disturbed stratigraphic layers. In China, similar patterns appear. Tax records show precipitous drops in registered households, meaning either mass mortality or mass migration as people fled failed agricultural regions. Imperial granaries were emptied trying to relieve widespread famine. Records describe snow in August in southern provinces, frost throughout summer in the north, the kind of climate chaos that would have been unthinkable before it happened. And here's what's really terrifying about all these accounts, both written and archaeological. They describe something that nobody alive had ever seen before, something without precedent in living memory. These weren't people experiencing their second or third climate crisis and knowing they could survive. This was entirely new, entirely unexpected, entirely unexplainable within their frameworks of understanding. Imagine being a farmer in 536. Your grandfather farmed this land, his grandfather before him. For generations beyond counting, your family has followed the same seasonal patterns. You know when to plant, when to harvest, how to read the weather signs. Your entire identity is built on this accumulated knowledge, and then suddenly in a single season, all that knowledge becomes worthless. The sky betrays you. The seasons fail. Everything your ancestors learned means nothing because the world itself has changed. That's the psychological catastrophe the sources are describing. Not just physical suffering, though there was plenty of that, but existential crisis, the fundamental unreliability of existence itself. When the sun can fail, when summer can refuse to arrive, when the basic patterns of life can simply stop working, what's left to believe in? And they had no idea it was just beginning. The dimmed sun was only the first symptom of something far worse coming. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand what actually caused this darkness, how modern science finally solved a mystery that had haunted historians for centuries, because the answer turned out to be even more dramatic than anyone had imagined. For over 1,000 years, the event of 536 AD remained one of history's greatest mysteries. Medieval chroniclers had recorded it, their terrified accounts preserved in monastery libraries and imperial archives, but nobody knew what had caused it. Nobody understood why the sun had vanished, or how a climate catastrophe could strike so suddenly and last so long. The written records told what happened, but not why. Then in the 1990s, scientists began finding answers, not in dusty manuscript or archaeological digs, but in some of the most unlikely places imaginable, buried deep in glacial ice, hidden in the growth, rings of ancient trees, trapped in layers of sediment at the bottom of lakes. The Earth itself had been keeping records all along, records far more detailed and precise than any human chronicle. Scientists just had to learn how to read them. The breakthrough came from ice. Specifically, from ice cores drilled out of the Greenland ice sheet and Antarctic glaciers. Now these aren't just any chunks of ice. These cores are vertical time capsules, preserving a year-by-year record of atmospheric conditions going back hundreds of thousands of years. Every winter, snow falls on the ice sheets. Every summer, that snow gets buried by more snow. Over centuries and millennia, the layers compress into ice, trapping tiny bubbles of ancient air and microscopic particles of whatever was floating in the atmosphere when that layer formed. Drill down deep enough, and you're literally looking at a snapshot of the air your ancestors breathed. Pollen from plants that grew centuries ago, dust from long-forgotten droughts, and crucially for our story, volcanic sulfates. When a volcano erupts with enough force to inject material into the stratosphere, it doesn't just create local devastation, it spreads sulfur compounds across the entire planet. These sulfates eventually fall out of the atmosphere, getting captured in snowfall and preserved in ice. They leave a signature, a chemical fingerprint that scientists can detect and measure thousands of years later. In the early 1990s, glaciologists started finding something extraordinary in ice cores dated to the mid-6th century. Massive spikes in sulfate concentrations. Not small bumps like you'd see from minor eruptions, but enormous peaks indicating truly catastrophic volcanic activity. The 536 AD layer showed sulfate levels rivaling those from the 1815 Tambora eruption, which killed 71,000 people directly and caused the year without a summer that led to global crop failures and mass starvation. But here's where it gets really interesting. The ice cores showed not just one spike, but multiple eruptions clustered together. There was a major event in 536, another significant eruption in 540, and a third around 547. This wasn't a single volcanic disaster. It was a volcanic crisis, a decade-long bombardment of the atmosphere with sulfur and ash that kept temperatures suppressed for years beyond what a single eruption could achieve. The ice core evidence was revolutionary, but it had limitations. It could tell scientists when eruptions occurred and roughly how powerful they were, but it couldn't pinpoint where they happened. A volcanic signature preserved in Greenland ice could have originated from anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere. Scientists needed more evidence, more pieces of the puzzle. That's where dendrochronology came in. The science of tree ring analysis. Every year, trees add a new growth ring. Wide rings indicate good, growing conditions with plenty of warmth and moisture. Narrow rings suggest stress, usually from cold temperatures, drought, or both. And here's the beautiful thing. Trees that overlap in time can be matched ring by ring, allowing scientists to build continuous chronologies going back thousands of years. You start with a living tree, match its inner rings to the outer rings of a dead tree, match that dead tree's inner rings to even older preserved wood, and so on. By the 1990s and 2000s, dendrochronologists had built precisely dated tree ring chronologies covering the past several millennia from multiple locations worldwide: European oaks, Siberian pine, bristlecone pines from California, corrie trees from New Zealand, ancient logs preserved in Irish bogs. Each chronology represented hundreds of individual trees, thousands of precisely dated annual rings, creating an unbroken record of past climate conditions. When researchers started examining these chronologies around the year 536, they found something stunning. Trees from across the northern hemisphere showed their narrowest rings in over 1,500 years, not just in one region, but simultaneously across Europe, Asia, and North America. The growth suppression started abruptly in 536 and continued for years afterward, with a secondary crash around 540–541. Some trees barely grew at all. 1,000-year-old bristlecone pines that had survived countless droughts and cold snaps showed rings so narrow they were barely visible under magnification. The southern hemisphere showed similar patterns, though slightly less extreme. Trees in Chile and New Zealand exhibited suppressed growth during the same period, confirming that this was a truly global event, not just a regional climate fluctuation. But the dendrochronology provided more than just confirmation. The precise dating of tree rings allowed scientists to reconstruct a year-by-year timeline of the crisis. They could see the sudden crash in 536, watch the slight recovery in 537–538, then see conditions worsen again after the 540 eruption. They could track how long it took for normal growth patterns to resume, more than a decade in some regions. Most importantly, tree rings from different locations showed slightly different patterns of stress, providing clues about regional climate variations. European trees showed extreme cold. Mediterranean trees indicated both cold and drought. Asian trees revealed massive monsoon failures. Each chronology added detail to the picture, transforming vague ancient descriptions of dim sun and year without summer into precise measurements of temperature depression and precipitation changes. But scientists still faced a fundamental question. Which volcanoes? The ice cores and tree rings proved massive eruptions had occurred, but Earth has thousands of volcanoes. Without knowing which ones had blown, researchers couldn't fully understand the event or assess the risk of it happening again. This is where geochemical fingerprinting comes in, the most sophisticated and fascinating piece of detective work in the entire investigation. Different volcanoes have different chemical signatures based on the composition of their magma chambers. The ratios of various isotopes, trace elements, and chemical compounds are like DNA, unique to each volcanic system. When a volcano erupts, it preserves that signature in the ash and sulfates it spreads across the planet. Scientists can extract tiny particles from ice cores, analyze their chemical composition, and match them to known volcanic sources. It's CSI, but for ancient eruptions. The analysis took years and required some of the most sophisticated equipment available. Mass spectrometers capable of detecting atoms at parts per billion concentrations. Electron microscopes to examine individual ash particles. laboratories equipped to handle microscopic samples without contamination. Slowly, painstakingly, researchers began building a chemical profile of the 536 event. They extracted volcanic glass shards from the ice. They measured isotope ratios. They compared their findings to samples from volcanic deposits around the world. The breakthrough came in the 2010s, when multiple research teams converged on a surprising conclusion. The primary eruption, the one that kicked off the catastrophe in early 536, likely came from a volcano in the tropics. The chemical signature didn't match Icelandic or Mediterranean sources as some had suspected. It pointed to a volcanic system much farther south, somewhere near the equator where eruptions would have maximum global impact because stratospheric winds could distribute sulfates to both hemispheres. The leading candidate emerged: Ilopango, a massive volcanic complex in what is now El Salvador. Ilopango had produced one of the most violent eruptions in Central American history sometime in the 5th or 6th century. The explosion has been so powerful, it created a crater lake 4 miles across and deposited ash layers meters thick across a 1,000 square mile area. It had completely depopulated the Maya territories in the region, leaving them abandoned for decades. Dating Ilopango precisely had always been difficult. Radiocarbon dates from charcoal buried in the eruption deposits gave wide ranges somewhere between 400 and 600 AD. But when researchers analyzed the geochemical signature of Ilopango ash and compared it to particles extracted from the 536 ice core layers, they found a compelling match. The isotope ratios fit. The trace element composition aligned. The volcanic glass shards showed consistent characteristics. More evidence emerged. Studies of lake sediments in Central America showed massive erosion and flooding events in the late 530s, exactly what you'd expect following a major eruption that stripped vegetation from the landscape. Mayan archaeological sites showed clear abandonment horizons dating to the same period, with evidence of ashfall and environmental catastrophe. Ilopango became the prime suspect for the 536 eruption, a tropical supereruption, perhaps reaching VEI level 6 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, injecting tens of millions of tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, the kind of eruption that happens once every few hundred years if you're unlucky, once every few thousand if you're lucky. But Ilopango wasn't acting alone. The ice cores showed clearly that other eruptions followed in close succession. The 540 event showed a different chemical signature, pointing to a northern hemisphere source, possibly Iceland. Iceland's volcanic systems were extremely active during this period, and several major eruptions have been dated to the 6th century using similar forensic techniques. The 547 eruption appears to have been another tropical event, possibly from Indonesia or the Philippines, regions with incredibly active volcanic systems capable of producing stratospheric eruptions. The exact volcanoes remain debated, but the pattern is clear. Between 536 and 547, Earth experienced a cluster of major volcanic eruptions unlike anything seen in the previous 1,000 years. This clustering is crucial to understanding why the 536 event was so devastating. A single large eruption, even one as powerful as Ilopango, typically affects climate for 2 to 3 years. The sulfates fall out of the atmosphere relatively quickly, temperatures recover, and life goes on. But when multiple eruptions occur in rapid succession, they create a compounding effect. Each new injection of sulfates resets the clock, preventing atmospheric recovery. The cooling becomes sustained rather than temporary. Instead of a brief crisis, you get a decade-long catastrophe. The precision with which scientists have dated this volcanic cluster is remarkable. They're not just saying sometime in the 6th century. They're pinpointing individual eruptions to specific years, sometimes specific seasons. This precision comes from cross-referencing multiple lines of evidence, comparing ice core chemistry with tree ring chronologies, matching both to historical records and archaeological data. For example, the initial 536 eruption can be dated to early spring of that year, based on its position in the annual ice layers and the timing of growth suppression in tree rings. Trees that were already growing when the eruption occurred show a mid-season shift from normal to suppressed growth. Trees at higher latitudes show slightly delayed impacts compared to those nearer the equator, exactly what you'd expect as stratospheric sulfate clouds spread gradually from tropical to polar regions. The 540 eruption can be dated even more precisely, to late 539 or very early 540, based on its position in ice layers and the timing of renewed growth suppression in tree rings that were just beginning to recover from the 536 event. Medieval chroniclers noted renewed dimming of the sun in 540, providing independent confirmation of the ice core and tree ring evidence. Comparing the 536 event to modern eruptions puts its scale in perspective. Tambora in 1815, which produced the year without a summer and caused global crop failures, released about 60 million tons of sulfur dioxide. Krakatoa in 1883, which killed over 36,000 people and created spectacular sunsets worldwide, released about 20 million tons. The 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines, the largest eruption of the 20th century, released 17 million tons and measurably cooled global temperatures for 2 years. Estimates for Ilopango's 536 eruption range from 50 to 100 million tons of sulfur dioxide, putting it in the same league as Tambora. But Tambora was followed by atmospheric recovery within 3 years. The 536-547 volcanic crisis involved multiple eruptions of similar or nearly similar magnitude compressed into just over a decade. The cumulative sulfur loading of the atmosphere was unprecedented in the historical record. The ice core evidence shows sustained high sulfate concentrations throughout this period, with peaks in 536, 540, and 547, but never dropping back to baseline levels. This sustained atmospheric pollution created the prolonged cooling visible in tree rings and documented in historical records. It's like the difference between getting punched once versus getting beaten continuously for 10 minutes. The total energy might be similar, but the sustained assault prevents recovery and causes far greater damage. Modern volcanic monitoring gives us perspective on what ancient populations were witnessing without understanding. When Mount Pinatubo erupted in 1991, scientists tracked the sulfate cloud as it spread around the globe. They measured stratospheric sulfur concentrations. They calculated the percentage of solar radiation being blocked, about 2% to 3% on average, with peaks up to 10% in areas directly under the densest parts of the cloud. Those numbers might sound small, but a 2% to 3% reduction in incoming solar radiation translates to global temperature depression of about 0.5 to 0.6 degrees Celsius. That's enough to cause widespread crop failures, shift weather patterns, and trigger regional famines. The 536 event, based on ice core sulfate concentrations and tree ring evidence, likely blocked 5% to 10% of incoming solar radiation for several years, possibly more in some regions. This translates to cooling of 1.5 to 3 degrees Celsius, comparable to the temperature difference between our current climate and the Little Ice Age that devastated European agriculture from 1300 to 1850. And this cooling hit an agricultural system with no modern technology, no global food trade, no weather forecasting, no scientific understanding of what was happening. Just farmers watching their crops fail year after year, rulers watching their kingdoms descend into famine and chaos, all wondering why the gods had abandoned them. The scientific detective work of the late 20th and early 21st centuries finally gave them an answer. Not divine punishment, not the end of the world, just bad timing. A cluster of volcanic eruptions that happened to coincide, creating perfect conditions for catastrophe. The research continues. Every year brings new ice core analysis, more refined tree ring chronologies, better chemical fingerprinting techniques. Scientists are now examining ocean sediments, cave formations, and even ancient pollen deposits for additional evidence. They're building increasingly detailed reconstructions of not just when and where eruptions occurred, but exactly how they affected different regions, which populations suffered most, how long recovery took in different environments. This isn't just academic curiosity. It's about understanding risks we still face today. Earth's volcanic systems haven't become less dangerous. If anything, our vastly larger global population and more interconnected society might be even more vulnerable to a similar crisis than 6th century civilizations were. Understanding the 536 event helps us prepare for the possibility, however remote, that it might happen again. That somewhere, perhaps in Indonesia or Central America or Iceland, a volcano is building toward an eruption that could plunge our world into crisis just as suddenly as it plunged the Byzantine Empire, the Maya, and countless other societies into their darkest years. The ice remembers, the trees remember, and now, finally, we remember too. So now we need to understand the mechanics, because here's the thing about volcanic eruptions and climate change. They're not what most people think. When you imagine a volcano cooling the planet, you probably picture ash blocking out the sun, right? Massive clouds of black particles floating in the air, creating darkness. And yes, that happens. But ash falls out of the atmosphere quickly. Days, maybe weeks. The ash isn't what caused the disaster of 536 AD. What caused it was something far more insidious, something that stayed in the atmosphere not for days or weeks, but for years. Sulfur dioxide. Let me explain how this works, because understanding the chemistry is understanding why this event was so catastrophic. When a volcano erupts with enough force, it doesn't just send material up a few thousand feet. It punches through the troposphere, the lower layer of atmosphere where weather happens, and injects material directly into the stratosphere. We're talking about 10 to 15 miles up, where the air is thin and there's basically no weather, and when massive amounts of sulfur dioxide reach the stratosphere, something remarkable and terrible happens. It reacts with water vapor to form tiny droplets of sulfuric acid. These aren't the big droplets you'd see in clouds. These are microscopic particles, aerosols so small they can stay suspended in the stratosphere for years. And here's why that matters. At that altitude, there's no rain to wash them away. There's no weather patterns to bring them down. They just spread, carried by stratospheric winds, forming a global veil that reflects sunlight back into space before it can reach the ground. Think of it like this. The sun is constantly bombarding Earth with energy. Most of that energy reaches the surface, warms the land and oceans, drives our weather systems, makes plants grow. It's the foundation of everything we depend on. Now imagine someone installing a mirror in the stratosphere. Not a perfect mirror, but a hazy, diffuse one that reflects maybe 1 or 2% of incoming sunlight back into space. Doesn't sound like much, right? Just 1 or 2%. But that small change is enough to drop global temperatures by 5 to 2, 5 degrees Celsius, enough to devastate agriculture worldwide, enough to kill millions. And the really terrifying part, once those sulfur aerosols are up there, there's nothing anyone can do about them. No technology, no ritual, no prayer is bringing them down. You just have to wait. Wait while they slowly, gradually fall out of the stratosphere over months and years. Wait while your crops fail and your children go hungry and your civilization crumbles. But the temperature drop is just the beginning. Because when you change global temperatures, even by a couple degrees, you don't just make things colder, you fundamentally disrupt the entire climate system. And nothing gets disrupted more dramatically than the monsoons. Monsoon patterns are driven by temperature differences between land and ocean. During summer, land heats up faster than water, creating a pressure difference that pulls moist ocean air inland. That's your monsoon, the seasonal rains that billions of people across Asia and Africa depend on for agriculture. But when volcanic aerosols reduce sunlight, the land doesn't heat up as much. The temperature difference weakens, and the monsoons fail. This is what happened after 536 AD. Historical records from China describe drought where there should have been rain. Indian texts mention failed monsoons leading to famine. In East Africa, the seasonal rains that filled the Nile didn't come. Agriculture across the entire monsoon belt from West Africa to Southeast Asia collapsed simultaneously. Not because of local conditions, but because a volcanic eruption halfway around the world had disrupted the fundamental atmospheric circulation patterns that drive rainfall across an entire hemisphere, and precipitation changes weren't limited to the tropics. In Europe and North America, the cooling caused by volcanic aerosols altered the jet stream, the river of high-altitude wind that guides weather systems. When global temperatures drop, the jet stream becomes more unstable, creating what meteorologists call blocking patterns. These are situations where weather systems get stuck in place for weeks or months. If you're in a drought pattern, it stays dry. If you're in a wet pattern, it rains continuously. Either way, it's a disaster for agriculture. The Byzantine chronicles describe exactly this kind of pattern. Some regions experiencing unprecedented drought while others, just a few hundred miles away, were flooded with continuous rain that rotted crops in the fields. This wasn't coincidence. This was the signature of a disrupted jet stream, of a climate system thrown into chaos by volcanic cooling. Now here's where the story gets even more catastrophic, because the evidence increasingly suggests that 536 AD wasn't just one volcanic eruption. It was multiple eruptions over several years, each one injecting more sulfur dioxide into an atmosphere that hadn't yet recovered from the previous event. The ice core data shows a massive spike in 536, but then additional spikes in 540 and 547. 3 major eruptions within a decade, possibly 4, each one reloading the stratosphere with sulfur aerosols just as the previous veil was beginning to clear. This is what scientists call a volcanic winter, and it's fundamentally different from a single eruption event. One big eruption causes maybe 2 years of significant cooling, then things start recovering. But multiple eruptions create a compound effect. The climate never gets a chance to bounce back. The aerosol veil persists for years, maybe a decade or more, and each year of cooling makes the next year worse, because the effects accumulate. Failed harvests mean no seed for next year's planting. Starving populations are more vulnerable to disease. Social systems stressed by 1 year of crisis can't handle a second or third year. It's like hitting someone who's already on the ground. The first punch might knock them down. The second punch, delivered before they can recover, breaks bones. The third punch might kill them. That's what happened to civilizations in the 6th century. One eruption they might have survived. Multiple eruptions within a decade. That was civilization ending. And we can understand just how devastating this was by comparing it to other volcanic climate events in history. The 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia, the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history, caused what's known as the Year Without a Summer in 1816. Global temperatures dropped by about 0.5 to 1 degree Celsius. Crop failures across Europe and North America caused widespread famine. Snow fell in June in New England. Frost killed crops in July in Germany. But Tambora was one eruption, and the climate recovered within 2 to 3 years. The 536 AD event was worse. Multiple eruptions, longer duration, greater temperature drops, more widespread disruption. Scientists have also studied what they call volcanic winters in the context of nuclear winter scenarios. Because the atmospheric physics are similar, whether you're injecting sulfur aerosols from volcanoes or soot from burning cities, the effect is the same. A stratospheric veil that blocks sunlight and crashes global temperatures. The models developed during the Cold War to understand nuclear winter actually help us understand volcanic winters. And what those models show is terrifying. A temperature drop of 2 degrees Celsius globally doesn't just mean everything gets a bit colder. It means growing seasons shrink by weeks. It means frost dates shift, so crops that were viable before now fail regularly. It means precipitation patterns change, so regions that were productive become marginal, and marginal regions become uninhabitable. Most critically, it means agricultural production drops by 20, 30, maybe 40% worldwide. In a pre-industrial society with no food reserves, no global trade networks, no agricultural technology, that kind of production drop means mass starvation. But here's what makes volcanic cooling especially insidious compared to other climate disasters. It happens fast. A volcanic eruption can inject enough sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere in a single day to change global climate for years. There's no gradual warming you can adapt to, no slow drought you can prepare for. One day the climate is normal. A few weeks later, after the aerosols have spread globally, temperatures plummet and the sun looks strange and dim. By the time you realize what's happening, by the time the failed harvests make the crisis undeniable, it's already too late to do anything but survive or die. And the people of 536 AD had no framework for understanding what was happening to them. They didn't know about stratospheric aerosols or sulfur dioxide chemistry. They couldn't look at ice cores or analyze atmospheric composition. All they knew was that the sun had dimmed, the seasons had changed, and their world was ending. Some blamed it on divine punishment. Others thought it was the end times. A few maybe recognized it as a natural disaster, but even they had no way to predict how long it would last or what would come next. The atmospheric chemistry that caused their suffering was elegant and precise. Sulfur dioxide molecules reacting with water vapor in the stratosphere to form sulfuric acid aerosols. Those aerosols reflecting incoming solar radiation back into space. The reduced solar input lowering global temperatures. The temperature changes disrupting circulation patterns that drive monsoons and precipitation. each step following inexorably from the one before, like dominoes falling. Except these dominoes were made of civilizations, and perhaps the most frightening aspect of volcanic climate forcing is that we now know it can happen again. There are volcanic systems around the world capable of producing eruptions as large or larger than what caused the 536 AD event, Yellowstone, Toba, Campiflagre near Naples. These are all supervolcano systems that have erupted catastrophically in the past and will erupt again in the future. We can't predict when. Could be next year, could be 100,000 years from now. But when they do erupt, they'll inject the same sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, create the same aerosol veil, cause the same global cooling, and despite all our modern technology, despite all our climate models and early warning systems, there's still nothing we can do to prevent the climate disruption that follows. We can prepare better than the people of 536 AD. We have food reserves, global trade networks, agricultural technologies that are more resilient, but we're also more dependent on just-in-time supply chains, more vulnerable to cascading system failures, more numerous, and thus requiring more food production. A volcanic winter today might not kill half the global population like it did in the 6th century, but it would still be catastrophic, still cause famines, still trigger conflicts, still test the limits of our social systems. The mechanics are universal. Volcanic sulfur dioxide, stratospheric aerosols, reflected sunlight, global cooling, failed harvests, famine. It's happened before, it'll happen again. The only question is when, and whether we'll be any better equipped to survive it than our ancestors were 1,500 years ago. But in 536 AD, the mechanical understanding didn't matter. What mattered was the human experience of living through it. What mattered was watching the domino effect as climate disaster cascaded into social collapse. Because here's the thing about crop failures in the ancient world. They weren't just about hunger. Put a farming community through one bad harvest and they could survive. Most societies kept grain reserves, maybe enough for a year if they were lucky. But take away the sun for 18 months, drop temperatures by 3 degrees Celsius, and you're not dealing with one bad harvest. You're dealing with total systemic collapse. And that's exactly what happened starting in 536 AD. The first domino fell in the fields. Across Europe, the Middle East and Asia, farmers who had planted their spring crops watched in horror as nothing grew. The seed sprouted, sure, but without adequate sunlight. The seedlings just withered. Photosynthesis doesn't work in perpetual twilight. It's not a matter of plants growing slowly. They literally cannot produce the energy they need to survive. Summer crops failed completely. Wheat, barley, millet, all the staples that fed ancient civilizations, they just died in the fields. In normal years, even during droughts or floods, you'd get something. Maybe half a harvest, maybe a quarter, enough to scrape by. In 536, in many regions, farmers harvested nothing at all. But it gets worse, because the temperature drop didn't just affect that year's crops. It fundamentally altered the growing season. Places that had been reliably agricultural for centuries suddenly couldn't support farming at all. The frost-free period shrank. Growing seasons that had lasted 6 months were compressed to 3 or 4. And here's the cruel mathematics of that. Most grain crops need 90 to 120 days from planting to harvest. Cut the frost-free period below that, and you're not farming anymore. You're just wasting seeds. By the fall of 536, people across the northern hemisphere were facing a simple, terrifying reality. the food was gone. Grain reserves that were supposed to last through one bad winter were now all that stood between millions of people and starvation. And nobody knew if the sun was ever coming back. The second domino fell in the storehouses. Because those grain reserves weren't just sitting around waiting to be distributed fairly to everyone who needed them. This was the 6th century. Political power meant control of food supplies. When the harvest failed, the powerful hoarded what remained. Wealthy landowners locked up their grain stores. Military leaders seized food for their armies. Church officials controlled their own reserves, doling them out to secure loyalty and obedience. For ordinary farmers and labourers, the people who actually grew the food, there was nothing. Within months, famine conditions weren't just present, they were universal. Contemporary sources describe horrors that sound like something from an apocalyptic nightmare. In Ireland, the annals record that the crop failure led to a failure of bread. That dry phrase conceals unspeakable suffering. No bread meant no food at all for populations that depended almost entirely on grain. In China, the chronicles describe people eating tree bark and making soup from grass. When the bark ran out, they ate the grass itself. When the grass was gone, they ate things I won't describe because they're too disturbing. Starvation doesn't just mean feeling hungry, it means your body consuming itself. Muscle tissue breaks down, organs begin to fail, the immune system collapses, children's development stops, pregnant women miscarry, the elderly die first, then the very young, then finally the adults who thought they were strong enough to survive. And this wasn't happening for months, it was happening for years. Because even when the volcanic aerosols finally began to clear, even when the sun started returning to something like normal brightness, the damage was done. Farming doesn't just restart like flipping a switch. You need seeds, and people had eaten their seed grain. You need draft animals, and people had slaughtered and eaten those too. You need farmers with enough strength to work the fields, and populations were so weakened that many couldn't perform the physical labour required. The archaeological evidence for this agricultural collapse is everywhere once you know where to look. Tree ring data from this period shows growth rings compressed to almost nothing. Physical evidence of multiple consecutive years when trees barely grew at all. Pollen analysis from lake sediments shows dramatic decreases in agricultural plant species and increases in wild vegetation. The farms were literally reverting to wilderness. Ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica show another horrifying detail. Lead pollution in the atmosphere dropped dramatically during this period. That's significant because lead pollution in the ancient world came primarily from silver mining and smelting. When the lead signature drops, it means mining stopped. And mining stopped because economies had collapsed so completely that there was no point in extracting precious metals. You can't eat silver. When people are starving, the entire economic system that had supported civilization simply ceased to function. The third domino fell in the cities. Urban populations in the ancient world were completely dependent on food imports from surrounding agricultural regions. Cities don't produce food, they consume it. Constantinople, the great capital of the Byzantine Empire, housed perhaps 500,000 people. Every single one of them ate grain that had been grown somewhere else, transported along supply chains that stretched across the Mediterranean and beyond. When the harvest failed across all those agricultural regions simultaneously, the supply chains broke. Ships that would normally carry grain to Constantinople carried nothing because there was no grain to carry. Trade networks that had functioned for centuries simply stopped operating. And 500,000 people in a city with no food reserves faced a choice: flee or die. Urban populations began collapsing. Not just shrinking, collapsing. People abandoned cities that had been continuously inhabited for hundreds or thousands of years. They fled into the countryside, hoping to find something, anything to eat. But the countryside was already picked clean. Rural populations were dying too, and they weren't going to share their last scraps with desperate refugees from the cities. This created the fourth domino: mass migration and social chaos. When entire populations are on the move, when traditional power structures are broken down, when there's no food and no hope, civilization doesn't just weaken, it shatters. The historical sources describe massive population movements during this period. Tribes that had been settled for generations suddenly became nomadic again, searching for resources. Borders that had been stable dissolved as weakened states lost the ability to defend their territories. Military forces that depended on regular provisioning either disbanded or turned to brigandage, taking by force what they could no longer acquire through normal supply chains. In this chaos, violence became epidemic. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of sudden violent destruction. Settlements burned. Mass graves filled with bodies showing signs of violent death. This wasn't organized warfare between armies. This was the warfare of desperation. Communities fighting communities for access to whatever resources remained. Bands of starving refugees attacking farming settlements. Everyone fighting everyone for the chance to survive one more day. But here's where the story gets even darker, because weakened, starving populations don't just die from lack of food, they become incredibly vulnerable to disease, and in 541 AD, 5 years after the sun disappeared, the fifth and final domino fell: plague. Not just any plague, the Justinianic plague, one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. The same bacterium that would later cause the Black Death, Yersinia pestis, emerged and spread across a world that had been devastated by 5 years of famine and chaos. Now you might wonder why the plague showed up exactly then. That's not a coincidence. Epidemiologists understand that famines create perfect conditions for pandemic disease. When populations are malnourished, immune systems fail. When social order breaks down, sanitation collapses. When people are crowded into cities or refugee camps, diseases spread explosively. The Justinianic plague probably originated somewhere in Central Asia or Northeast Africa. The details are murky, but what's clear is that by 541 AD it had reached the Mediterranean world, and it arrived in populations that had been weakened by 5 years of crop failures, starvation, and social collapse. The mortality was staggering. Contemporary sources describe bodies piling up faster than they could be buried. In Constantinople, the historian Procopius claimed 10,000 people were dying per day at the height of the epidemic. That's probably an exaggeration, but even if the real number was a tenth of that, you're still looking at catastrophic mortality. The plague didn't just kill, it completely overwhelmed every system societies had for dealing with death. Burial grounds filled up. Families couldn't bury their own dead. Authorities had to pile bodies into towers, old cisterns, anywhere they could find space. Ships were loaded with corpses and towed out to sea to be sunk. The dead vastly outnumbered the living, and the living were too sick, too weak, or too terrified to properly handle the remains. Economic activity that had already been crippled by the famine now stopped entirely. Markets closed because there was no one to buy or sell. Trade ceased because merchants were dead or dying. Fields that had finally been replanted were left unharvested because the farmers were dead. The plague and the famine created a feedback loop of death and collapse that fed on itself, each disaster making the other worse. Different regions experienced different levels of mortality, but estimates suggest that across the Mediterranean world, the plague killed between a quarter and half of the population. In some areas, particularly urban centres, mortality may have exceeded 60%. Think about what that means. Imagine your city, your town, your community. Now imagine that every other person you know is dead within a year. Not from war, not from old age, but from disease that strikes seemingly at random. Children, parents, grandparents, friends, all dead within weeks of showing the first symptoms. That's what the Justinianic plague did to populations that were already desperately weakened by years of famine. The social structures that had held civilization together simply disintegrated. Governments lost the ability to govern because the administrators were dead. Armies couldn't function because the soldiers were dead. Trade couldn't resume because the merchants were dead. Churches lost their authority because the priests were dead. Knowledge itself began to disappear. In a world without printing, information survived because people remembered it and taught it to others. But when scholars died without passing on their knowledge, when craftspeople died without training apprentices, when elders died without teaching the young, centuries of accumulated wisdom vanished in a single generation. The archaeological record shows the scale of this collapse in stark detail. Urban sites show massive depopulation. Buildings that had been continuously maintained for centuries were suddenly abandoned. Sophisticated infrastructure like aqueducts and roads fell into disrepair because there was nobody left to maintain them. Coin hoards buried during this period and never recovered speak to the desperation and sudden death that overtook their owners. What emerged from this catastrophe wasn't just a reduced population, it was a fundamentally different world. Political structures that had seemed permanent collapsed. The Byzantine Empire, which had been the dominant power in the Mediterranean, was so weakened it would never fully recover. In Western Europe, the political fragmentation that had begun with the fall of Rome accelerated dramatically. The network of Mediterranean trade that had connected civilizations for over 1,000 years shrank to a shadow of its former self. The combined death toll from the famine and the plague is almost impossible to calculate with any precision, but conservative estimates suggest tens of millions died. Some researchers think the number might have been higher, possibly approaching 100 million across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. In a world where the total population was perhaps 200 million, this represents an almost incomprehensible catastrophe. We're talking about one of the greatest demographic collapses in human history, a collapse triggered by a volcanic eruption that nobody understood, causing climate effects that nobody could predict, leading to agricultural failures, famines, mass migrations, social breakdown, and finally a plague pandemic that killed on a scale that wouldn't be matched until the Black Death 8 centuries later. All because the sun disappeared for 18 months. All because a volcano erupted in 536 AD. The dominoes fell, one after another, and when they finally stopped falling, the ancient world was gone. Now here's where things get really interesting. Because the 536 AD volcanic winter didn't just affect people uniformly. It hit different civilizations in radically different ways, depending on where they were, how they were organized, and what kind of safety nets they'd built into their societies. Some empires that seemed invincible collapsed completely. Others that looked vulnerable somehow managed to survive. And the reasons why tell us everything about what makes civilizations resilient when the world turns dark. Let's start with the empire that should have been strong enough to weather any storm. The Eastern Roman Empire, ruled by one of history's most ambitious emperors, Justinian III. In 536 AD, Justinian was at the peak of his power. He'd just reconquered North Africa from the Vandals. His generals were preparing to retake Italy from the Ostrogoths. He was rebuilding Constantinople into the most magnificent city on earth, with the Hagia Sophia under construction to demonstrate Roman glory for all eternity. This was supposed to be Rome's second golden age, the restoration of imperial greatness after centuries of decline. Then the sun disappeared. Justinian's dream of restoring the Roman Empire didn't just stall, it shattered completely. The Gothic War in Italy, which had been going relatively well, turned into a 20-year nightmare of starvation and devastation. The Italian countryside was depopulated. Cities that had survived since ancient times were abandoned. The agricultural base that had supported Roman civilization for centuries simply collapsed. The problem was timing. Justinian's armies needed food, lots of it. You can't maintain professional military forces without reliable agricultural surplus. When the harvest failed in 536, then failed again in 537, and again in 538, the entire imperial supply system broke down. Soldiers deserted because they weren't being paid or fed. Local populations turned against Roman garrisons that were requisitioning what little food remained. The reconquest that should have taken a few years dragged on for 2 decades and left Italy so devastated it would never fully recover. But here's what's fascinating. The Eastern Roman Empire itself didn't collapse. Constantinople survived. The imperial administration kept functioning, even with failing harvests, even with the catastrophic plague that followed, the empire held together. Why? Because Justinian had built redundancy into the system. The empire wasn't dependent on a single agricultural region. When Egyptian grain harvests failed, the empire could draw on supplies from Anatolia. When those failed, they could requisition from the Balkans. It was like a complex game of resource juggling where some balls kept falling, but the juggler somehow managed to keep enough in the air to prevent total collapse. They also had something else crucial, an administrative state with written records and professional bureaucrats who could manage crisis response even when the emperor himself fell ill. When plague hit Constantinople in 542 AD, Justinian nearly died. The empire should have fractured, but his bureaucrats kept tax collection going, kept food distribution systems operating, kept the military paid enough to prevent widespread mutiny. The Eastern Roman Empire survived the 536 crisis not because it was lucky, but because it had systems designed to handle catastrophic failure. Multiple agricultural zones, professional administration, written records that preserved knowledge across generations, urban centres that could redistribute resources when rural areas failed. But other civilizations weren't so resilient. 6,000 miles away, across the Atlantic, the greatest city in Mesoamerica was dying. Teotihuacan, the place of the gods, home to over 100,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world in the 6th century. A metropolis with monumental pyramids, sophisticated urban planning, and trade networks stretching from the American Southwest to Central America. In 536 AD, something went catastrophically wrong. The archaeological evidence is stark. Around the mid-6th century, possibly within just a few decades of the climate crisis, the city's ceremonial centre was systematically burned, not by foreign invaders, but by its own people. Then the city was abandoned, 100,000 people simply left. Now, archaeologists have debated for decades about why Teotihuacan collapsed. Political upheaval, rival cities, internal conflict, all have been proposed as explanations. But the timing is too perfect to ignore. The collapse happens exactly when the volcanic winter would have devastated Mesoamerican agriculture. And here's the thing about Teotihuacan. It had built its entire civilization on agricultural surplus from a very specific ecological zone. The city sat in a highland valley with limited agricultural land and relied on intensive farming techniques that required consistent rainfall and predictable growing seasons. When the climate shifted, when the rains failed year after year, the whole system collapsed like a house of cards. Unlike the Eastern Roman Empire with its multiple bread baskets, Teotihuacan had no backup plan. The city couldn't import food from distant regions because Mesoamerican civilizations didn't have long-distance bulk transport. No ships, no draft animals capable of pulling wagons, no infrastructure for moving grain across hundreds of miles. When the local harvest failed, that was it. Starvation was inevitable. The burning of the ceremonial center wasn't random violence. It was revolution. Archaeological evidence shows that the fires were carefully set in temples and elite residences, the symbols of authority. When the gods failed to bring back the sun, when the priests couldn't restore the harvests, the people of Teotihuacan stopped believing. They burned the temples and walked away. The city would never be rebuilt. For the next 1,000 years, until the Aztecs found its ruins and named it the Place of the Gods, Teotihuacan stood empty, a monument to what happens when civilization becomes too specialized, too dependent on conditions that can change without warning. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, another empire was fighting for survival. The Sasanian Persian Empire, Rome's eternal rival, the superpower of the East. The Sasanians controlled territory from Mesopotamia to Central Asia, some of the most productive agricultural land on earth. The Tigris and Euphrates river valleys, the breadbasket that had supported civilization since the Sumerians. They should have been able to weather any climate crisis, but they didn't. The archaeological record from Sasanian sites shows sudden abandonment of settlements in the 540s AD. Irrigation systems that had functioned for centuries fell into disrepair. Major cities shrank dramatically. The Sasanian Empire survived, but it was gutted, weakened in ways that would prove catastrophic when Arab armies arrived a century later. The problem was their irrigation systems. Mesopotamian agriculture had relied on sophisticated canal networks since ancient times. These systems were incredibly productive in normal conditions, but they had a fatal vulnerability. They required constant maintenance. You had to dredge canals, repair flood damage, manage water flow carefully to prevent salinization. This required enormous amounts of organized labor. When the harvest failed and populations began declining, there weren't enough workers to maintain the irrigation systems. Canals silted up. Flood control systems failed. Agricultural land was lost to salinization and flooding. Each year the empire could feed fewer people, which meant even less labor for maintenance, which meant even more agricultural land was lost. A death spiral of agricultural decline. And they faced another problem. The Silk Road trade that had enriched the empire for centuries was collapsing. Picture the Silk Road in the early 6th century. Caravans moving Chinese silk, Indian spices, and Central Asian horses westward to Roman markets. Roman gold, Egyptian grain, and Mediterranean glass heading east. The Sasanian Empire sat right in the middle, taxing everything that passed through. This transit trade was a major source of imperial revenue. When the climate crisis hit, trade volumes collapsed. Chinese silk production declined as agricultural failures led to social unrest. Indian Ocean monsoon patterns shifted, disrupting maritime trade routes. Roman demand for luxury goods plummeted as the empire struggled with famine. The Central Asian oasis cities that served as waypoints along the Silk Road began failing as water sources dried up. For the Sasanian Empire, this meant not just less tax revenue, but the collapse of the commercial networks that had integrated their territories. Cities that had thrived on trade withered. Merchants who had facilitated communication between regions disappeared. The empire became more fragmented, less connected, more vulnerable to the centrifugal forces that eventually pulled it apart. But the real crisis was happening on the steppes, the vast grasslands stretching from Hungary to Mongolia, home to nomadic pastoralist peoples who herded horses, sheep, and cattle across thousands of miles of open grassland. These steppe peoples were incredibly vulnerable to climate disruption. Their entire way of life depended on seasonal rainfall patterns that made grass grow predictably in specific regions at specific times. The nomads knew where water would be available, where pastures would be green, where their herds could feed. They'd built sophisticated knowledge systems passed down through generations about how to navigate these vast spaces and keep their animals alive. The volcanic winter shattered these patterns completely. The archaeological and historical evidence shows massive population movements beginning in the mid-6th century. Nomadic groups that had been stable for generations suddenly migrated thousands of miles, invading settled territories, conquering agricultural peoples, reshaping the political map of Eurasia. This wasn't random wandering. These were desperate refugees fleeing ecological collapse. When the steppes turned to desert, when water sources dried up, when their herds began dying, the nomads had two choices: migrate or perish. They chose migration. The Avars, a Turkic-speaking nomadic confederation, suddenly appeared in European sources in the 550s AD, invading the Balkans and threatening Constantinople. Where did they come from? Central Asia, driven westward by climate crisis on the eastern steppes. The Gökturks emerged around the same time, creating a vast empire stretching from the Black Sea to Manchuria. They weren't just conquering for glory. They were adapting to a transformed environment, creating political structures that could control resources across enormous territories when local conditions became unpredictable. In China, the Northern Wei dynasty fragmented in the mid-6th century, partly due to pressure from steppe nomads migrating southward as grasslands failed. The Chinese response was to build more walls, strengthen border defences, and absorb some nomadic groups as military settlers. But the old stable relationship between steppe and zone, between nomadic pastoralists and settled farmers, was breaking down. These nomadic migrations would reshape Eurasia for centuries. The Avars would dominate Central Europe for 250 years. The Turkic peoples would eventually create empires stretching from the Mediterranean to India. The crisis of 536 AD set in motion a complete reorganization of the Eurasian world. So why did some societies survive when others collapsed? What made the difference? Looking across all these cases, a pattern emerges. The civilizations that survived had three things in common. First, geographic diversity. The Eastern Roman Empire controlled territory from Egypt to the Balkans, multiple climate zones that wouldn't all fail simultaneously. When one region's harvests failed, others might still produce. Teotihuacan and the Sasanians, despite controlling large territories, were more dependent on specific agricultural systems. When those systems failed, They had no backup. Second, administrative complexity. The Byzantine bureaucracy could manage resource redistribution even during catastrophic crisis. They had written records, professional administrators, systems for moving food from surplus to deficit areas. Teotihuacan's political system, whatever it was, couldn't adapt. When crisis hit, it collapsed completely rather than reorganizing around new realities. Third, and perhaps most importantly, cultural flexibility. The societies that survived were willing to adapt, to change fundamental aspects of how they operated when circumstances demanded it. The nomadic peoples of the steppes completely reorganized their political systems, creating new confederations and empires. The Eastern Roman Empire shifted from offensive expansion to defensive consolidation. They adapted. Teotihuacan couldn't adapt. Its political and religious system was too rigid, too dependent on maintaining specific rituals and hierarchies that had worked in the past but couldn't respond to unprecedented crisis. When the old ways failed, there was no mechanism for trying new ones. The archaeological evidence of all this is heartbreaking. Sites across Eurasia, from Britain to China, show the same signature. Settlements abandoned in the mid-6th century, populations declining, sophisticated urban centres reverting to rural villages or disappearing entirely. In Scandinavia, pollen records show agricultural land returning to forest as farms were abandoned. In the Middle East, irrigation systems that had functioned since the Bronze Age fell into ruin. In Central America, cities that had thrived for centuries became ghost towns. The demographic impact lasted for generations. European population levels wouldn't recover to pre-536 levels until the 8th century, 200 years later. In some regions, the recovery took even longer. The population decline created labour shortages that fundamentally altered social structures. Slavery became less economically viable. Peasant labour became more valuable, leading to gradual improvements in the status of agricultural workers. The seeds of medieval feudalism, the manor system, the relationship between lords and peasants that would define European society for centuries, all trace back to the labour shortages that began in the 536 crisis. In the Sasanian Empire, the weakening of central authority that began in the 540s would prove catastrophic when Arab Muslim armies invaded in the 630s. The empire that had seemed invincible a century earlier collapsed in less than 2 decades. The crisis of 536 hadn't destroyed the Sasanian Empire immediately, but it had created fractures and vulnerabilities that proved fatal when the next challenge arrived. This is what really matters about the 536 crisis. It wasn't just about what happened in that terrible decade when the sun disappeared. It was about how those years of darkness created cascading consequences that reshaped civilizations for centuries afterward. The world that emerged from the volcanic winter was fundamentally different from the world that entered it. Different empires, different trade routes, different power structures, different relationships between nomadic and settled peoples. The crisis had acted like a great filter, eliminating civilizations that couldn't adapt and strengthening those that could change with changing circumstances. And nobody at the time understood what had happened. They couldn't see the volcanic eruptions that had caused the cooling. They didn't know about climate systems and agricultural carrying capacity. They just knew that the world had gone dark, the harvests had failed, and everything they'd built was falling apart. Some blamed the gods, some blamed human sin. Some blamed demons or cosmic forces beyond human comprehension, but none of them could see the real cause, the massive volcanic eruptions that had pumped sulfur into the stratosphere and triggered a climate catastrophe. They were living through one of history's greatest disasters without any understanding of why it was happening, and somehow some of them survived. But here's where this story gets truly nightmarish. Because if you thought volcanic winter was bad, if you thought widespread crop failure and famine were the worst things that could happen, well, nature had one more catastrophe waiting in the wings, and this one would make the darkness and hunger look like a warm-up act. Here's the thing about environmental disasters. They don't just kill people directly. They create conditions. They weaken societies, disrupt systems, force populations to move, drive people and animals into closer contact than normal. They create what epidemiologists call disease emergence events, opportunities for pathogens to jump from their normal hosts into human populations. The volcanic winter of 536 AD created the perfect storm for exactly this kind of event. Picture the Mediterranean world in the years after the sun disappeared. Crops had failed repeatedly. Food stores were depleted. People were malnourished, their immune systems compromised by years of inadequate nutrition. Cities were crowded with refugees fleeing the countryside where famine hit hardest. Sanitation systems were breaking down. Trade networks were disrupted, but merchants were still desperate to move whatever goods they could find. And somewhere in the highlands of East Africa, probably near the Great Lakes region, a particular species of bacterium was doing what bacteria do: evolving, adapting, finding new opportunities. The bacterium was Yersinia pestis, and it was about to change the course of human history. Now, Y. pestis had probably been infecting rodents and their fleas for thousands of years. That's its normal ecological niche. Rats get infected. Fleas pick up the bacteria when they bite infected rats. Then the fleas transmit it to other rats. A simple cycle that happens all the time in rodent populations without humans ever noticing. But the climate disruption of the 530s and 550s broke that cycle. The extreme weather patterns forced rat populations to migrate. Droughts in some regions drove them toward human settlements where food stores attracted them. Floods in other areas destroyed their normal habitats. Cold snaps killed off some populations while creating dense congregations of survivors in warmer microclimates, often near human dwellings. At the same time, agricultural disruption meant more grain was being stored for longer periods. Cities that normally consumed food quickly were hoarding whatever they could get. Perfect breeding grounds for rats. And where rats go, their fleas follow. But it gets worse. The famine conditions meant rat populations weren't thriving either. When rats start dying in large numbers, their fleas get desperate. They start looking for alternative hosts. And that's when they discover that humans, with our nice warm blood and our convenient proximity, make excellent substitutes. The first outbreak probably happened in Egypt around 541 AD. 5 years after the initial volcanic event, 5 years as climate disruption, famine, social stress, and ecological chaos. Contemporary sources describe it appearing first in Pelusium, a port city on Egypt's Mediterranean coast. From there, it spread with terrifying speed. Within months, it had reached Alexandria, Egypt's capital, and one of the largest cities in the Mediterranean world. And from Alexandria, it had access to everything. Because Alexandria wasn't just any city, it was a major hub of the grain trade that fed Constantinople, Rome, and cities throughout the Mediterranean. Ships were constantly arriving to pick up Egyptian grain and carry it to hungry populations across the empire. Those ships became disease vectors, floating incubators that could carry infected rats and fleas across hundreds of miles of open water. Within a year of the Egyptian outbreak, the plague had reached Constantinople. the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire and the largest city in Europe. The historian Procopius, who witnessed the plague first-hand in Constantinople, left us a description that still chills the blood 1,500 years later. He describes how the disease began with sudden fever. Victims felt hot, but not terribly ill at first. Many thought they'd recover, but then the real symptoms appeared. Buboes, swollen lymph nodes that erupted in the groin, armpits and neck. Sometimes they grew as large as a grapefruit. The pain was excruciating. The buboes would turn black as tissue died. Sometimes they would burst, releasing foul-smelling pus. Sometimes they would just continue growing until the victim died. Procopius describes people developing delirium, hallucinations. Some became violent, attacking family members who tried to care for them. Others fell into comas and never woke up. The speed was terrifying. Someone could be healthy in the morning and dead by evening. But what really scared contemporary observers was the unpredictability. Some people with massive buboes somehow survived. Others who seemed to have mild cases died suddenly. There was no pattern, no way to predict who would live and who would die. Modern analysis of plague DNA recovered from 6th century burial sites has confirmed what Procopius was describing. This was bubonic plague, caused by Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that would cause the Black Death 800 years later. But the 6th century strain was different. Genetic analysis shows it was an earlier variant, possibly even more virulent than the medieval plague. The DNA tells us something else too. This wasn't a single outbreak, it was multiple strains, multiple introduction events. The plague kept coming back, arriving from different directions, suggesting it had established itself in rodent populations across a wide geographic area. And once it reached Constantinople, it exploded. The city had maybe 500,000 people crammed inside its walls. People who were already weakened by years of food shortage. People living in dense housing with poor sanitation. People who depended on a constant flow of grain from Egypt. Grain that now arrived on ships carrying infected rats. Procopius claims that at the height of the outbreak, 10,000 people were dying every day in Constantinople. Modern historians think he was probably exaggerating, but not by much. Archaeological evidence from mass burial sites suggests mortality rates of 40 to 50% in urban areas, half the population dead within a few months. Think about what that means in practical terms. Cities couldn't bury their dead fast enough. Procopius describes corpses stacked in towers, stuffed into fortress walls, loaded onto ships and towed out to sea. The stench was overwhelming. Survivors could barely function, traumatized by watching friends and family die in horrible agony while not knowing if they'd be next. The social systems that held urban societies together started breaking down. Trade collapsed because merchants refused to enter plague cities. Agriculture suffered because there weren't enough workers to plant and harvest crops. Military campaigns ground to a halt as soldiers died or deserted to check on their families. Emperor Justinian himself caught the plague. He survived, but only barely, and he was never quite the same afterward. His ambitious plans to reconquer the Western Roman territories had to be abandoned. The empire's expansion stopped, reversed. Within a generation, much of what Justinian had gained was lost again. But here's what makes this truly devastating. The plague didn't just strike once and disappear. It kept coming back. The first pandemic wave, the one that hit Constantinople in 542 AD, was followed by a second wave in 558. then another in 573, then another in 599. For the next 200 years, roughly every 15 to 20 years, the plague would return. Different cities, different intensities, but always there, always killing. This pattern tells us something important. The plague had become endemic. It had established permanent reservoirs in rodent populations across the Mediterranean world. Every generation or so, when conditions were right, when rat populations exploded, or when flea populations were particularly active, it would spill over into human populations again. The demographic impact was catastrophic. Modern estimates suggest the Justinianic plague, counting all the recurring waves, killed between 25 and 50 million people over those 2 centuries. In some regions, population levels didn't recover until the 9th or 10th century. Entire cities were abandoned. Agricultural land returned to forest. Trade networks that had connected the Mediterranean world for centuries simply ceased to exist. And remember, this was all happening on top of the ongoing climate disruption. The volcanic winter of 536 was followed by another major eruption in 540, which caused another period of darkened skies and crop failures, then smaller eruptions throughout the 540s and 550s. The climate didn't fully stabilize until the late 6th century, so you had populations that were already weakened by famine and climate stress, then getting hammered repeatedly by waves of plague, generation after generation experiencing catastrophe. Children who survived one outbreak growing up to die in the next one. Communities rebuilding only to be devastated again. The comparison to the later Black Death is both instructive and terrifying. The medieval plague of 1347 to 1353 killed roughly a third of Europe's population in a single wave. It's remembered as one of the worst disasters in human history, but the Justinianic plague was arguably worse. It lasted longer, killed more people in total, and struck a civilization that was already reeling from environmental catastrophe. But here's what's really interesting. The social and religious responses were remarkably different between the 2 pandemics. During the Black Death, people turned on each other. They blamed Jews, lepers, foreigners. They formed flagellant movements, believing the plague was divine punishment for sin. They persecuted anyone who seemed different or suspicious. During the Justinianic plague, the response was more resigned, more theological than reactionary. 6th century Christians saw the plague as part of the general apocalyptic signs of the end times. They believed Christ would return soon, that this suffering was the final trial before the kingdom of God. This belief actually helped social cohesion in some ways. Instead of turning on each other, communities came together. They formed burial societies to care for plague victims and dispose of bodies. Wealthy families opened their homes as makeshift hospitals. Clergy stayed with dying parishioners even when it meant almost certain infection. But it also meant people didn't really try to fight the disease. They didn't quarantine infected areas or try to limit trade with plague regions. They saw it as God's will, something to be endured rather than prevented. The few attempts at public health measures came from secular authorities, not religious ones. Emperor Justinian tried to organize systematic burial of corpses and distribution of food to survivors. Some city appointed special plague marshals with authority to coordinate emergency responses. But these were ad hoc measures, not systematic public health policies. Nobody understood that rats and fleas were spreading the disease. They thought it was bad air, miasmas, divine punishment. Some physicians recommended burning aromatic woods to purify the atmosphere. Others suggested fleeing to the countryside, which actually was good advice, but not for the reasons they thought. The fascinating thing is that survivors seem to develop some immunity. Procopius and other sources note that people who survived one outbreak were less likely to die in subsequent waves. Modern understanding of plague immunity confirms this. Exposure to Y. pestis can provide partial protection against future infections, but this immunity couldn't save the civilization. Even with survivor resistance, each new wave of plague killed enough people to prevent recovery. Birth rates couldn't keep up with mortality. The population was aging, with fewer young people to work, fight, or have children of their own. And all of this, remember, was ultimately triggered by the volcanic winter of 536. Without the climate disruption, the plague might never have emerged from its African reservoir. Without the famine and social stress, it might not have spread so quickly or killed so many. Without the repeated crop failures and economic disruption, populations might have recovered between plague waves. Instead, you had a cascading catastrophe, each disaster making the next one worse. Climate change enabling plague emergence, plague weakening populations and making them more vulnerable to famine, famine creating conditions for more plague outbreaks, a vicious cycle that lasted for generations. The genetic evidence recovered from plague victims buried during the Justinianic pandemic tells us one more crucial thing. This strain of Y. pestis eventually went extinct. The lineage that caused the 6th century pandemic isn't the ancestor of the medieval Black Death strain. They're separate branches of the plague family tree, which means the Justinianic plague eventually burned itself out. The recurring waves got smaller, less deadly. By the 8th century, the pandemic was essentially over. The disease returned to its rodent reservoirs and stayed there for hundreds of years. But by then, the damage was done. The world that emerged from the Justinianic plague was fundamentally different from the world that had entered the volcanic winter of 536. The classical Roman civilization was gone, replaced by a patchwork of smaller kingdoms and emerging power structures. The unity of the Mediterranean world was shattered. The ancient trade networks had collapsed. A new age was beginning, one that historians would eventually call the Dark Ages, and it all started with a volcanic eruption that darkened the sun and created the conditions for one of history's worst pandemics. So here's the thing about 536 AD. It didn't just kill millions of people and collapse empires. It fundamentally reshaped the trajectory of human civilization in ways we're still discovering today. Because when you drop the global temperature by several degrees for multiple years, when you trigger famines that last a decade, when you create the perfect conditions for the deadliest pandemic in history, you're not just causing a crisis, you're rewriting the future. Medieval historian Michael McCormick from Harvard wasn't exaggerating when he called 536 the worst year to be alive. But the real story isn't just about that one terrible year. It's about what came after, the cascading consequences that rippled through decades, maybe centuries, the civilizations that never recovered, the empires that fell before they could rise, the technologies and knowledge that were lost, the world that might have been but never was. Let's start with something historians call the Late Antique Little Ice Age, because that volcanic winter that began in 536, it didn't end in 537, not even close. The cooling triggered by those eruptions persisted for more than a decade. Tree ring data from across the northern hemisphere shows suppressed growth continuing through the 540s. Ice cores reveal elevated volcanic aerosols in the atmosphere for years. The sun stayed dim, the summers stayed cold, the harvest stayed poor. Then in 540, just as things were beginning to stabilize, another massive eruption hit. probably somewhere in the tropics again. The sulfate spike in ice cores is almost as large as the 536 event. It was like getting punched in the face while you're still on the ground from the first blow. This created what climatologists now recognize as one of the coldest periods of the entire Holocene epoch. That's the last 11,700 years of relatively stable climate that allowed human civilization to flourish. For roughly 15 years, from 536 to around 550, global temperatures were lower than they had been at any point since the end of the last ice age. Some regions saw temperatures drop 4 to 5 degrees Celsius. In a world without modern heating, without global food distribution systems, without the technological buffers we take for granted, that was catastrophic. But the climate impact was just the beginning, because here's what happens when you starve entire regions for a decade. Social structures break down, trade networks collapse, governments lose legitimacy, people abandon cities, knowledge is lost. And once those systems fail, they don't just bounce back when the sun returns. Rebuilding takes generations, if it happens at all. The Eastern Roman Empire, Justinian's realm, provides the clearest example. Before 536, Byzantium was ascending. Justinian had reconquered North Africa from the Vandals. His generals were pushing into Italy, reclaiming the old Roman territories. The dream of restoring the full Roman Empire seemed achievable. Then came the darkness, the famine, and the plague. By 550, that dream was dead. The empire's population had been cut by perhaps a third. Its economy was shattered. Its armies were depleted. The reconquest of Italy turned into a grinding 20-year war that exhausted both sides. More importantly, Byzantium never fully recovered its pre-536 population and power. The empire that had seemed poised to dominate the Mediterranean instead became a defensive, diminished state, constantly fighting for survival. Some historians argue that without the 536 event and its aftermath, there might never have been an Islamic conquest in the 7th century. Byzantium and Persia, both weakened by decades of climate crisis and plague, couldn't resist the sudden expansion of Arab armies after 630. A stronger, healthier Byzantine Empire might have held. The same pattern repeats across Eurasia. The Sassanid Persian Empire, already weakened by decades of war with Byzantium, was further devastated by famine and plague. China's Northern Wei dynasty, which had unified northern China, began fragmenting in the 530s, partly due to famines that undermined government authority. The Maya civilization in Central America, which we discussed earlier, began its long decline from which some cities never recovered. This is the vulnerability that climate historians want us to understand. Complex civilizations, for all their achievements, are incredibly fragile. They depend on agricultural surplus. They require functioning trade networks. They need political stability. Take away the food supply for even a few years, and the whole edifice can collapse. The more complex and interconnected the civilization, the more vulnerable it becomes to systemic shocks. Modern industrial civilization has created buffers. We have global food markets that can ship grain from surplus regions to deficit areas. We have strategic reserves. We have heating systems that can keep people alive through cold summers. We have scientific understanding of what's happening and why, but we've also created new vulnerabilities. 7 billion people depend on global supply chains that assume stable climate conditions. Our just-in-time production systems have no slack. Our cities contain populations far beyond what local agriculture could ever support. So what happens if we face another 536-style event? The good news is we'd see it coming. Modern volcanic monitoring systems are vastly more sophisticated than anything medieval monks could have imagined. We have seismographs tracking earthquake swarms that precede eruptions. We have satellite sensors measuring sulfur dioxide emissions and ground deformation. We have international warning systems that can detect volcanic activity anywhere on Earth within hours. The USGS operates volcano observatories monitoring dozens of potentially dangerous volcanoes in the United States alone. Similar systems exist across Japan, Indonesia, Italy, Iceland, and every other volcanically active region. When a major eruption is imminent, we'd know days or weeks in advance. We'd be able to evacuate people from the immediate danger zone. We'd be able to prepare for the climate impacts. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Knowing what's coming doesn't mean we can stop it. If a volcano the size of Krakatoa or Tambora erupts tomorrow, we'd watch the sulfur dioxide plume rise into the stratosphere and understand exactly what was about to happen. We'd know that global temperatures would drop. We'd know that growing seasons would be disrupted. We'd know that food prices would spike and people would starve, and we'd be largely powerless to prevent any of it. Some scientists have proposed geoengineering solutions. In theory, we could inject aerosols into the stratosphere to counteract the cooling effects of volcanic sulfates. Or we could accelerate the chemical reactions that remove sulfur from the atmosphere. But these technologies remain theoretical, untested at scale, and potentially dangerous. The cure might be worse than the disease. The more realistic preparation involves building resilience into our food systems, creating genuine strategic reserves that could feed populations through multiple years of disrupted harvests, developing cold-resistant crop varieties that could produce yields even in shortened growing seasons, establishing rapid response systems for distributing food and medical supplies. Most importantly, maintaining diversity in our agricultural systems. Monocultures are efficient in good times but catastrophically vulnerable to systemic shocks. But there's another lesson from 536 that's equally important: the interconnection of climate, disease, and social stability. The Justinianic plague didn't emerge from nowhere. It was created by the conditions of famine and disruption. Rat populations exploded as grain stores were mismanaged. Human immune systems were weakened by malnutrition. Trade networks carried disease faster than information about it. Social breakdown created the perfect conditions for pandemic spread. Modern epidemiologists recognize this pattern. The deadliest pandemics in history, from the Black Death to the 1918 flu, have typically emerged during periods of social and environmental stress. War, famine, displacement, and climate disruption create conditions where diseases can jump from animals to humans and spread rapidly through vulnerable populations. The COVID-19 pandemic, which emerged during a period of relative peace and prosperity, was comparatively mild compared to what a pandemic during a major climate crisis could cause. This is why climate scientists and public health experts increasingly work together. They understand that you can't separate climate stability from disease risk. A world dealing with crop failures and mass migration from climate change is also a world at higher risk for emerging infectious diseases. The same systems that would help us weather a volcanic winter would also help us prevent or contain pandemics. Archaeological research continues to uncover new evidence of the 536 event's impact. Excavations of medieval settlements show sudden abandonment during the 530s and 540s. Cemetery analysis reveals spikes in mortality and changes in burial practices consistent with mass death events. Isotope analysis of human remains shows evidence of malnutrition and dietary stress. written records that were preserved tell only part of the story. The physical evidence is filling in the gaps, and the picture keeps getting worse. In Scandinavia, archaeologists have identified more than 1,500 gold hoards buried during the 6th century. These weren't normal treasure burials. They were desperate acts by people who expected to return and retrieve their wealth but never did. The sheer number of these hoards, all buried within a few decades, suggests a society in collapse. People were dying or fleeing faster than they could recover their valuables. In Britain, recent excavations show that many Romano-British towns that had survived the collapse of Roman rule in the 5th century were finally abandoned in the 6th century. For decades, historians assumed this abandonment was due to Anglo-Saxon invasions. Now we know the climate crisis and plague played major roles. People were dying or fleeing not because of invaders, but because the cities couldn't feed themselves anymore. But here's what gives me hope, and it's the same thing that made our species survive that genetic bottleneck 900,000 years ago. Humans are absurdly resilient. We're creative problem solvers. We cooperate under pressure. We adapt to conditions that should kill us. The people of 536 didn't have climate models, or volcanic monitoring systems, or strategic grain reserves. They didn't understand what was happening to them, and they survived anyway. Not all of them, not even most of them in some regions. But enough to rebuild, enough to create the medieval world that came after, enough to ensure that we're here today having this conversation. Every person alive today is descended from someone who survived the 536 event, just like every person alive carries genes from those 1,280 bottleneck survivors. We are all products of catastrophe, all evidence that sometimes when everything goes wrong, human beings find a way to endure. Medieval texts from the decades after 536 show something remarkable. People kept records, they kept learning, they kept building. Within a generation of the worst climate disaster in historical times, monasteries were copying ancient texts, craftsmen were building cathedrals, farmers were developing new agricultural techniques. The darkness hadn't destroyed human curiosity or ambition. If anything, it had refined it. This is the final lesson of 536 AD. Catastrophes happen. Climate disasters, pandemics, volcanic winters. These aren't aberrations in human history. They're part of it. The question isn't whether we'll face another crisis like 536. Given enough time, we certainly will. The question is whether we'll be prepared, whether we'll have built the resilience and cooperation necessary to weather it, whether we'll emerge from the darkness still capable of building the future. Because that's what the survivors of 536 did. They endured the worst year in human history. They buried their dead. They planted crops in cold soil and prayed for harvest that barely came. They kept their children alive through years of darkness, and eventually, when the sun returned to full strength and the temperatures stabilized and the plague burned itself out, they rebuilt. The medieval world that emerged from the 6th century crisis was different from what came before. Smaller, poorer, more fragmented in some ways. But it was also tougher, adapted to survive in a world where catastrophe was always possible. The institutions and technologies and social structures that developed in medieval Europe, Asia and elsewhere were shaped by the memory of those terrible years. We should remember 536 AD, not just as the worst year to be alive, but as proof that even the worst years don't have to be the end. The sun eventually came back. It always does. The question is what we do in the darkness, and what we build when the light returns. So here we are, at the end of humanity's darkest year. But here's the thing about 536 AD. It wasn't really one year, It was the beginning of a cascade that would last for generations. The volcanic eruption that dimmed the sun. Then the climate collapse. Then the harvest failures. Then the famine that killed millions. Then the rats multiplying in abandoned grain stores. Then the fleas carrying Yersinia pestis, spreading from those rats to humans. Then the Justinianic plague killing half the population of the Mediterranean world. Each catastrophe creating the conditions for the next one. Each disaster making recovery from the previous one impossible. It's like watching dominoes fall, except each domino is a civilization, and the people falling are real humans with real lives, real families, real hopes that were never realized. The Byzantine Empire never fully recovered. Neither did the Sasanian Persians. The classical world, already weakened by centuries of conflict and economic strain, took a blow from which it would never truly heal. Within a century, a new religion would explode out of Arabia, filling the power vacuum created by the plague years. The medieval world was being born in the aftermath of catastrophe. But some survived. Some communities held together through the darkness. Some leaders managed to keep their people fed and organized even when the sun disappeared and the plague came knocking. The question that haunts historians is, why? What made the difference between the societies that collapsed completely and the ones that bent but didn't break? The answer seems to be the same as it was during the Great Bottleneck 900,000 years earlier. Connection. Communities that maintained networks with other communities, that shared resources when times got tough, that didn't turn inward and isolate themselves. These were the ones that survived, the ones that tried to go it alone, that hoarded their dwindling supplies and refused to cooperate with neighbors. These were the ones that disappeared from the historical record. It's a lesson we're still learning today. No civilization, no matter how powerful, is immune to catastrophic environmental change. The Roman Empire at its height controlled 70 million people, had sophisticated agriculture, extensive trade networks, advanced engineering, and it was nearly destroyed by a volcanic eruption halfway around the world, an eruption nobody saw coming that created consequences nobody could predict. That triggered a cascade of disasters nobody knew how to stop. We live in a more connected world now. Our trade networks span the globe. Our communication is instantaneous. Our scientific understanding is vastly superior to anything the ancients possessed. But we're also more dependent on those systems than any previous civilization. What happens when the dominoes start falling? What happens when one disaster creates the conditions for the next, and the next, and the next? The people of 536 AD can't answer that question, but they can remind us that it happens, that civilizations don't just gradually decline. Sometimes they collapse suddenly, catastrophically, taking down millions of people who thought their world was permanent. But they can also remind us that humans are survivors, that we've been through worse and come out the other side, that 1,280 breeding individuals once kept the entire human species alive for 117,000 years, that the descendants of those survivors built everything we see around us today. We carry their genes, their resilience, their desperate, stubborn refusal to give up even when the world seems to be ending. Every person alive today is descended from someone who survived something terrible. War, famine, plague, climate disaster. Somewhere in your family tree, someone made it through when most didn't. The year 536 AD was humanity's darkest year in recorded history, but it wasn't the end. It was just another chapter in the long story of human survival, Another test that some passed and some failed. Another reminder that we're tougher than we think, but more fragile than we'd like to believe. Before you drift off to sleep, if you found this journey through humanity's darkest year interesting, give this video a like. It helps more people discover these forgotten stories. Leave a comment telling us where you're listening from, what part of the world you call home. Are you descended from the survivors of 536 AD? Statistically, if you have European, Middle Eastern or North African ancestry, the answer is probably yes. And subscribe for more history that helps you understand how we got here, where we came from, what we survived to become who we are today. For now, rest easy. The sun came back. The plague eventually ended. The survivors rebuilt. They always do. Sleep well.